We're all familiar with that handwritten copy of the Declaration of Independence. You know, the one with the fancy cursive script with July 4th, 1776 on top and that big John Hancock signature at the bottom, declaring the United Colonies to be free and independent states, absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown. We've carried home copies of the Declaration from our field trips, usually in scroll form, maybe tied with a ribbon. We've watched this declaration get stolen in national treasure. But that version of the Declaration of Independence wasn't created until August of 1776. And it's unlikely that the signers of this declaration were all in the same room at the same time. So why is this declaration dated July 4th, 1776? Well, it turns out that the story of our Declaration of Independence is messier and murkier than we sometimes remember it. This is Found in Philadelphia, a podcast dedicated to telling the stories of Philadelphia's past so that we can better understand the present, because our history matters. I'm your host, Lori Ament. With each episode, I hope that you'll learn something new, see things a little differently, and be inspired to go discover some of this history for yourself, right here in the city of brotherly love. This is part of a series for the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. In this series, we're collaborating with some of the people who created the Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia. We're taking this moment to reflect and ask questions about the city's past and what that means for us today. And just a reminder that you can support the podcast by leaving a review and telling a friend to check it out. If you're curious about what's going on with the podcast in between episodes, you can sign up for the podcast newsletter at the website foundinphiladelphia.com. I want to start this history of the Declaration of Independence in a printing studio where I've been spending some time this past year. Because the Declaration of Independence was first set to be printed on July 4th, 1776. On that day in Philadelphia, someone from the Continental Congress walked from what we now call Independence Hall to the print shop of John Dunlap at the southeast corner of 2nd and Market Streets. This person probably arrived with an untidy, handwritten final draft of the Declaration, freshly edited by the Congress, with words crossed out and other words squeezed in. And from that messy scrawl, they asked Dunlap to print as many copies of the Declaration as he could, as fast as he possibly could. So Dunlap got to work, setting the type. In Congress, July 4th, 1776, a declaration. And it was this hastily printed Declaration of Independence that first burst upon the world, establishing July 4th as the birthday of the United States. So I've been learning how to set type and pull prints to try and understand what printing in colonial Philadelphia would have looked like. Let me introduce you to Jessica Peterson. She's the director of the Common Press, which is the University of Pennsylvania's letterpress and typography research lab. In 2026, Jessica's been inviting people like me to her letterpress studio to learn more about the first printing of the Declaration of Independence. She's been running a year-long project called the Typography of Independence.
The idea of the Typography of Independence is to make duplicates of the original document from start to finish, meaning that we researched what type was used and had it cast in the same typeface. Then we are making paper the way it was made in 1776 and are going to pull sheets of paper and then print a duplicate of the Declaration on those sheets of paper in May of 2026. And anybody from anywhere is invited to make an appointment to come in and pull their own copy of the Declaration from the hand press.
I personally got to set the type for line 21 of Jessica's replica Declaration. And if you're in Philly or plan to be in Philly from June to December in 2026, I highly recommend you stop by and print your own copy in her studio. I'll put a link in the podcast notes. I'm going to assume that you're like me and you don't understand the basics of the printing process used in 1776. So I asked Jessica to walk us through it. First, you have the written text that you want to put into print. And you've decided how you want to lay it out on the page, the type and size of the font you want to use, the width of columns, that kind of thing. And this is an art form in itself. Then the next step is setting the type. The type are these individual pieces of metal with a single letter that is raised on one end, like a stamp. And the type can get pretty small. For 12-point font, which is the standard size for a lot of documents today, the type is really just these little slices of metal. They're as tall and wide as the letter you'd see on the page, and maybe half an inch long. And so you line up this loose type in a composing stick. Here's Jessica.
You set type along a composing stick, and that composing stick is set with a certain line length. Composing stick is like a metal tray that has an element called a knee, and you put the knee in to set your line length, and then you line up the letters in the composing stick. And I'm just going to set the letters. I pull each letter out of its individual wooden space in this type case. After each letter is placed, you put spacing between the words, and then you get something called leading, which is what sets the line length. And they're long strips of metal, and they go between the lines of type. So that the way I think about it is like they're the bones of the body of type, and the letters are the flesh of and the muscles.
Now you have to take these loose lines of type and leading on the composing stick and transfer them into the bed of the press itself, locking them securely in place. At the Common Press, they use a pre-electric printing press from 1876, but that's the closest they have to a colonial era press.
And then line by line, you place the type into the printing press. It's still a very fragile, amorphous form then. And then you use furniture, which is another tool, and coins and keys to lock the type in place so it becomes like a solid body of type. So then to print the text, usually someone who's an expert at inking comes with ink balls, which are just leather sacks attached to sticks, and they expertly apply ink to the surface of the type. Then somebody who has clean hands, who's not the inker or the printer, lays the paper on the type, and then the printer operates the printing press, which makes an impression of the ink and type on the paper. Usually the paper hanger pulls the print off afterwards. And then you do proofing, which is you print copies of it. It's very hard to typeset a document without errors, so you do a proof and then have somebody else, usually not the typesetter, check for errors.
And once you've fixed all the errors, you're off and running, printing as many copies as you want. Now, maybe at this point you're thinking, did she say ink balls? She did. And I actually got a chance to use them on one of my visits. So let me try to describe them to you. Ink balls are made of wood sticks that are carved to have a wide funnel shape at one end. Wool is stuffed into that funnel shape, and then the wool is covered with leather that gets tacked into the wood, giving you a sort of lollipop with a wool-stuffed leather pillow at one end. The leather pillow end gets inked up and used to transfer the ink onto the bed of metal type. And this was tricky because the ink of that era was mixed to a tar-like consistency. Here's Jessica.
The inker is also somebody who has a lot of mystery around them because it's really hard to evenly apply tar-like substance onto a very small surface in a consistent and even way. So if you don't do that, you end up with words that are blotted out by the ink or big blotches of ink all over your type and you can't read it. So you need someone who can expertly apply this very even and small amount of ink with a very unwieldy leather sack.
There's one other bit of print history I want to share, and that's about the metal type that Jessica is using. It's a special typeface, what we call a font, that's called Caslon. And Caslon was only about 50 years old at the time it was used for the printing of the Declaration of Independence. Today, we're used to having a huge variety of fonts to choose from, Arial, Times New Roman, but that wasn't true in the early 1700s. Jessica told me that everyone secretly agreed that the prettiest type back then was Garamond. which you can still find in your list of commonly used fonts in a Word document today. The only problem was that Garamond was designed by the French. And that was a problem for the British, who had been at war with the French for hundreds of years. But then along came Caslon. Here's Jessica.
In 1725, this man named Caslon, who was really good at engraving letters on gun handles, developed the Caslon typeface. And there's documented letters and communications where people are so excited because finally there's a beautiful typeface designed by someone who spoke English to print English words. So that King George II, who was King George I's father, made Caslon the official typographer of the Court of England, and Caslon becomes synonymous with the British Empire. So all the royal documents are sent in Caslon, and then everything gets sent in Caslon. It's just like everyone goes crazy for Caslon.
And like so many things in the colonial era, metal type was only available from England.
There wasn't any typecasting in the United States till after the Revolutionary War, so definitely any type that was in the United States had come from England on a boat. And like you can read shipping documents where the metal was sent across the ocean, and it's very heavy, so it's like noteworthy for a lot of shipping logs that these little boxes of type were on the boats because it was very heavy material.
So getting Caslon type was an investment of time, of money, and freight. We're going to leave Jessica, our modern-day printer, and take a closer look at the printing business in the colonial era. And for that, I want to introduce you to Joseph Adelman, professor of history at Framingham State University and author of Revolutionary Networks, The Business and Politics of Printing the News, 1763 to 1789. And this year, he's also a visiting senior fellow at Brown University. I asked Joe to describe what we would see if we walked through the door of a print shop, sometimes called a printing office, in a place like Philadelphia before the American Revolution.
The average printing office in the colonies and in a place like Philadelphia would have had 2 printing presses. So these are relatively large, mostly wooden structures that have an iron screw and an iron literal press, right? You're pushing down on the paper to force the ink into it. And there's probably 2 of those that are bolted to the floor and to the ceiling because you're putting a lot of stress on them. And if you don't bolt them down, your printing is going to be bad and you're going to break your press from the stress of pulling at the joints. It's probably not a large space. There's probably about a half dozen or so people working in the space, ranging from a master printer or printers. There's sometimes partnerships. Probably 1 or 2 journeymen who would be adult men who have completed their apprenticeships but are working for pay rather than running their own office. And then possibly some number of apprentices who would be teenage boys who early in their apprenticeship would be doing more menial tasks. They would be wandering the city to deliver newspapers or pick up supplies. In the shop, they would be doing tasks like sweeping the floor. They might be replacing type into the sorts. The cases that you put the type into, each individual letter after you were done with it had to be pulled out and put back into its right place so that you spelled things correctly the next time when you were setting the type.
The printing office was commonly also the master printer's home. So you might find other members of the household working there.
There might also be women in the office. It's very common for the wife of the master printer to be involved in some way in running the shop, whether that's keeping the books or sometimes selling stationery, selling books, selling other items. The wife of the master printer is also running a dormitory. The more common experience is for the apprentices to live with the master printer full time. And so upstairs, she's preparing food, keeping the household running, and boarding a couple of teenage boys.
And because this is the colonial period in Philadelphia, some printers' households included enslaved people too. And that includes Philly's most famous printer.
It was not uncommon to walk into a printing office and see an enslaved person of African descent. That gets more true as you go further south, but it's definitely true in Philadelphia. We know that Benjamin Franklin enslaved multiple people through his lifetime. We know that he did not sell or free them, that he kept them until their deaths. The historian David Waldstreicher says that there's evidence as early as the 1730s, and there's definite proof by the 1750s of two different people. So we know that Franklin held people as slaves.
What about the future printer of the Declaration of Independence, John Dunlap? Well, John Dunlap learned to print in his Uncle William's household here in Philadelphia, which included a young enslaved man they called Primus. William Dunlap, the uncle, married into the close-knit family of Benjamin Franklin, and Franklin helped William establish himself as a printer in Pennsylvania, helping him get set up with a press and that precious metal type. In 1756, John Dunlap left Ireland at the age of 10 to apprentice with his uncle in Philadelphia. 2 years later, William set up his own independent press at the southeast corner of 2nd and Market Streets, bringing his nephew with him. In that same year, historians believe that William purchased and enslaved Primus. And from later correspondence with some of William's apprentices, it appears that Primus was skilled enough to be considered, quote, fit to be put to press. In 1766, John, then only 20 years old, took over the printing business from his uncle. There's no evidence that John owned or forced enslaved people to work in his print shop. That's not to say that he didn't profit from slavery, but more on that in a bit. However, it's likely that John apprenticed in a print shop alongside the enslaved young man, Primus. And that wasn't at all an unusual experience in colonial Philadelphia. So what would John Dunlap have learned in his apprenticeship? Here is Joe again to explain.
Through your apprenticeship, you pick up what are called the arts and mysteries of the trade, and that's true for every trade. When you sign a formal apprenticeship document, part of what the master is supposed to teach you is the arts and mysteries of the trade. So there's technical skills, composing, pulling type, and setting letters in each place, setting the type onto the printing stone, inking and pulling the press, and the paper is all the same size, no matter what size the book or pamphlet or newspaper ends up. The sheet of paper that you put through the printing press is the same, so you have to learn which way to orient the pages so that when you fold everything and cut the paper down to a very small book, you know which one faces up and down and which pages go together. So there's all these technical skills to start that a printer needs.
One thing that did surprise me, Joe told me that printers don't necessarily need to be able to read, though many did.
You have to recognize the letters and be able to put them in order to set the type, but that's not the same as understanding what you're reading. So it's not a strict requirement to be literate in the sense of being able to take a text and read and understand it. By the 1760s, by the end of the colonial period, beginnings of the imperial crisis, it's basically common for printers to have literacy.
So we've discussed that printers needed a lot of technical skills, and many knew how to read and write. But that wasn't enough. Colonial printers also had to be fairly savvy at building connections with people because printers traded in information. Here's Joe again.
The job of a printer at a technical level is about setting type and working the press. The rest of the job of the printer is about gathering and serving as a hub for information. And so they need to be able to effectively communicate with people all across colonial society. They themselves are sort of middle-of-the-road artisans. They work with their hands. It is a laborious trade. People's bodies break down from working as printers. But they have to be in contact with the ministers and the lawyers and the government officials and know how to deal with all of them to get information into their office so it can go back out the other side in pamphlets or newspapers or whatever other form of print they're running.
So let's take a look at some of the kinds of printing that colonial printers were doing to support their business. An important client was the local colonial government.
It's really important to maintain government support because they issue contracts for government printing to print the laws of the colony, the journals of the legislature, to print all sorts of proclamations and court proceedings, all sorts of things off the press. And the government actually pays its bills compared to a lot of other people. So it's a really good thing to have.
And Joe told me that Philadelphia provided extra opportunity for printers because it was the center of colonial Pennsylvania's political infighting.
Now, in a place like Pennsylvania, the governor through the colonial era is still somebody from the Penn family, or somebody picked by the Penn family, and so it's a proprietary figure. The colonial assembly doesn't always support the Penns, in fact is often at quite an opposition to the Penns. And so you can earn the assembly printing contract, which is separate from the governor's printing contract, by being affiliated with the anti-proprietary party.
So printers in Philly were navigating and, frankly, profiting from the need for these different political factions to get their messages out there. Printers also produce printed material for the local community.
So the most popular one is an almanac, which almost everybody owns. And because that includes calculations of the sun and the moon, those vary by latitude. And so you have to have a different almanac in Philadelphia than you do in New York, than you do in Baltimore, way different than you have in Boston or anywhere in New England. So those are by necessity local. A lot of the other things, like, for example, broadsides, have a very local audience. Broadsides are what we would call posters. They're usually one side of one sheet of paper. They're often meant to be hung up and posted in places around town, so they're meant to be local in audience.
And broadsides were printed to broadcast everything from royal proclamations to notices of meetings to religious sermons and popular songs. Posting these broadsides in public places was a way to get information out into the local community. But what about newspapers? Well, Joe told me that colonial newspapers didn't really focus on local news.
Local news is still something that can be passed largely by word of mouth for the audience of the newspapers, which is upper class men. And in a town, Boston, Philadelphia, have 15 to 20,000 people at this time. Once you break down the number of women, the number of children, the number of people who are servants, the intended audience for the newspaper is maybe about 2,000 people total. And so the things that are going on in Philadelphia, they talk to each other. What they're interested in is news from London, imperial goings-on, debates in Parliament, believe it or not, royal gossip, and the many, many children of George III and Queen Charlotte, political essays, news from other colonies that is more difficult to get.
So while there may have been a few tidbits from Philly, most colonial newspapers in the city focused on reprinting news from the centers of power in Europe. Colonial newspapers also contained a lot of advertisements. Just like today, these ads helped support the newspaper. Back then, about a third of the paper was ads. And these ads bring us back to the issue of printers in Philadelphia profiting from slavery. I'll let Joe explain.
Whether or not a printing office employed enslaved labor, they are running advertisements, and a very common form of advertisement is for runaway slaves by owners trying to retrieve them and the economic value that attaches to them in the 18th century. Printers like Franklin, William Bradford, all the Philadelphia printers are making significant amounts of money on those advertisements. Printers also sometimes served as the interlocutor for those transactions. Because they were hubs for information, when you posted an advertisement, you might ask the person with information to go to the printer rather than directly to you, and the printer would act as an intermediary to work the money and the people or goods, whatever it was. So printers, whether or not they own slaves, are generating revenue from the slave trade and slavery.
And these rewards offered for enslaved people who had self-emancipated created a vigilante mindset where anyone could profit from returning the enslaved to bondage at their local print shop. Like so many other moments in the shining story of the Revolution that we tell ourselves, the tragedy of unfreedom is also there too. Joe mentioned another Philadelphia printer, William Bradford, a contemporary of John Dunlap. I want to take a minute to look at Bradford because I think he can help us understand the unique role played by printers during the American Revolution. Like John Dunlap, William Bradford apprenticed in Philadelphia to his uncle, the printer Andrew Bradford, who published the first newspaper in Pennsylvania. Both Dunlap and Bradford also learned the trade in households that included enslaved Africans. In 1742, Andrew Bradford died, and his estate included 2 enslaved men, Harry and Tansey, as well as an unnamed enslaved woman. Bradford then established his own printing business in Philadelphia, also as a young man in his 20s. Coming from a lineage of printers, both men had established connections that helped them gain steady print work from the colonial government. And these connections helped them fill their newspapers with news from around the Atlantic. And both men published, quote, runaway slave ads and acted as intermediaries for returning enslaved people to bondage. And both William Bradford and John Dunlap would ultimately support the Patriot cause, become printers to the Continental Congress, and fight in the American Revolution. But we're not quite there yet. William Bradford's career differs from John Dunlap in that Bradford established the Old London Coffee House at the southwest corner of Front and Market Street in 1754. And this is right at the other end of the same block as the Dunlap's print shop. Bradford's London coffee shop offered annual memberships at a price that only well-to-do men could afford. The benefits included, of course, a subscription to Bradford's newspaper, the Pennsylvania Journal. And only members could post announcements on the walls in the public area of the coffee house. Members also had access to the upper story rooms, where these men could hold meetings, browse directories of other members, and peruse a large selection of newspapers from other colonial cities and abroad. And all of these newspapers, the public information posted on the walls, and the members themselves would have provided information for Bradford's own newspaper. The Old London Coffee House became a place where all kinds of business took place. And the Market Street frontage of Bradford's Coffee House is also infamous for being the place where enslaved Africans were publicly auctioned in Philadelphia. And it was this same coffee house that became a hotbed of protest in the years leading up to the American Revolution. Let's have a quick refresher on why the colonists started to sour on the British government in the 1760s. Let's start in 1763, which marked the end of a global war between major European powers. Part of that struggle took place between British and French forces in North America, supported by Native American and colonial fighters. We call this part of the conflict the French and Indian War, and it ended with a treaty that allowed Britain to take control of North America east of the Mississippi. The war also left Britain deeply in debt. Following the war, Britain did a bunch of things that angered the colonists, but I'm going to tell you about 2. First, to keep the peace, Britain signed a treaty with its Native American allies that kept colonists from settling lands to the west, past the Appalachians. And second, to help settle its debts, Britain levied taxes on the colonists in North America. This led to the famous cry of taxation without representation. First came the Sugar Act in 1764 that placed import duties on sugar and other important items. Then the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act of 1765. And this one was particularly hated because it was the first direct tax in the colonies. It required that all public documents, whether written or printed, had to be done on paper bearing an official stamp that had to be purchased from government-appointed stamp collectors. And this tax was especially hated by printers because it affected everything they produced. It all required paper. From government and court documents to contracts, mortgages, and licenses, it impacted pamphlets, newspapers, and those lucrative advertisements. Even almanacs, which were often a moneymaker, would have to be printed on stamped paper. Printers hated the Stamp Act, and pretty much everyone else did too. Here's Joseph Adelman again.
News of the Stamp Act arrives in the colonies roughly in the middle of May of 1765, with an announcement that the start date for collecting the tax is going to be November 1st. So there's about a 5-month window before the act takes effect. In Philadelphia, as we get into the summer and fall of 1765, though, the Stamp Act is very unpopular. And so it hits printers really hard because it hits at the core of their business and puts them into deep debt that they've got to recover because they have to lay out the money in advance, but it also hits all of business and law and society in a way that's unifying. So even people who think that Parliament has the right to do it, a lot of them think that it's a bad idea.
And printers were uniquely positioned to organize and influence the resistance to the Stamp Act. The Philadelphia printer, William Bradford, in particular, was at the center of the Stamp Act protest in the city. He was a staunch supporter of the colonists' rights, and he had influence with his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Journal. Joe tells us how Bradford the printer grew more influential as a newspaper editor, reporting on the Stamp Act protests during the summer and fall of 1765.
For places like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, there are 3, 4, 5 newspapers, which means when there's a Stamp Act protest, there's 3, 4, 5 different accounts. They're not producing original text about the protest, but when William Bradford hears about the protests in Boston, he can look at a loyalist paper like the Boston Newsletter, or he can look at a patriot paper like the Boston Gazette. Those have different kinds of accounts of how violent the protest was, and who it targeted, and how appropriate it was, and how the crowd behaved. And simply by selecting which of those two accounts, they're making political choices for their readers and exerting control through their editing of what then appears in the newspaper, because that then gets circulated to another place.
Then, the day before the Stamp Act is about to go into effect, Bradford published a special edition of his Pennsylvania Journal.
And in October of 1765, his strategy is to claim that the Stamp Act is killing his newspaper, literally, and killing the freedom of the press. So on October 31st, 1765, the day before the act is supposed to take effect, he prints an edition of the Pennsylvania Journal where the front page is artistically designed to look like a tombstone. And it's not because it's Halloween, it's because the act is going to kill the newspaper. And he's got in the corner where the stamp is supposed to go a little picture of a skull and crossbones that says an emblem of the effects of the stamp. And then on the back, on page 4 of the newspaper, in place of one of the advertisements, has a coffin that says, "Departed this life, the Pennsylvania Journal, aged 23 years, of a stamp in her vitals." Just this vivid illustration of the idea that this parliamentary act is literally killing the newspaper.
So what happened on November 1st, 1765, when the Stamp Act was supposed to go into effect? Well, in the 13 British colonies, no one used any stamped paper because there was none to be had. The protesters had forced all of the stamp collectors to resign or to refuse to enforce the Stamp Act. And in some places, like New York, the stamp paper had actually been burned. In October, in Philadelphia, a group opposed to the Stamp Act gathered at the Old London Coffee House before marching with drums to the stamp collector's house to intimidate him into refusing to accept the stamped paper. Bradford's Coffee House had become the gathering spot for those who stood against the Stamp Act. To understand the importance of Bradford's Coffee House at this moment, I want to introduce you to another historian. Michelle Craig McDonald has worked in universities, museums, and historic sites for 30 years, most recently as the director of the Library Museum at the American Philosophical Society. She's also the author of Coffee Nation. Michelle described a special relic that was posted on Bradford's Coffee House walls.
When there was a burning of stamped paper in New York, Bradford somehow got a hold of a piece of it and pinned that to his coffee house wall, not only to demonstrate that stamped paper was abhorrent, but also to ensure people that this was not just, a Pennsylvania event. These were colonies coming together with a different joint mission.
To further protest the Stamp Act, colonists in Philadelphia and across the colonies agreed to an embargo of British goods. They'd refuse to buy British imports until the act was repealed. They called these non-importation agreements, and it was critical that they form a united front. Michelle explains how Bradford's Coffee House was transformed into the headquarters for Pennsylvania's resistance to these British taxes.
Think of those same walls as holding up our non-importation agreements. The 300 plus people in Philadelphia, merchants, traders, shopkeepers, including 6 women, by the way, who met to sign the 1765 non-importation agreement to protest the Stamp Act, they met at the Old London Coffee House. And that's where the non-importation agreement was posted, and also where it was printed, because the Old London was owned by William Bradford. So this non-importation agreement went directly from the conversation in the coffee house onto printed broadsides and then being distributed throughout the city for people to be aware of what the business community's stance was on Parliament's actions.
The Stamp Act was eventually repealed the following year in March 1766, but that was just the beginning. The following year, in 1767, the British Parliament enacted the Townshend Acts, placing import duties on goods such as china, glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. All things that they thought would be hard for the colonists to produce on their own. Colonists in Boston boycotted. British troops were sent in, people resisted, and in March 1770, British troops fired into a mob, killing 5 people, an event we call the Boston Massacre. Britain repealed the Townshend Acts, with the exception of the tax on tea. Those opposed to Britain's actions got organized. Here's Michelle again.
Most of the colonies created committees of correspondence to write to each other, to let them know what was happening in their communities, and committees of observation and compliance to ensure that local business owners were doing what they were supposed to be doing to put pressure on Britain to repeal its policies. Those groups met in the coffee house as well. It makes complete sense to me. These were their business centers before colonial protest really took hold. It makes sense that they're going to be their platforms for protest as we're approaching and during the Revolution.
So in Philadelphia, the Patriot Committees met at Bradford's Old London Coffee House. And to send us out, Joe Adelman explains how the committee's network of information and the power of the press helped avert a Boston Tea Party in Philadelphia.
In the fall of 1773, the British send 7 tea ships to America. 4 to Boston, 1 to New York, 1 to Philadelphia, 1 to Charleston, South Carolina. Through the fall of 1773, the newspapers exert great amounts of energy and ink on trying to figure out where these ships are, how much tea they've got, and when they're going to land. The first ones land in Boston at the end of November, and then there's that famous standoff for 3 weeks. And on December 16th, at the end of that standoff, people board the 3 ships in Boston, dump the tea into the harbor. There's a really good, sophisticated communication network now, so Paul Revere immediately gets on a horse and rides south with news of the Boston Tea Party. Goes to New York, somebody, maybe Revere, goes on to Philadelphia, and arrives in Philadelphia on December 24th, so 7 to 8 days after the tea has been dumped in the harbor, which is twice as fast as news normally takes to get from Boston to Philadelphia. Bradford prints that news. The headline is "A Christmas Box for the Readers of the Pennsylvania Journal." It's got accounts from the Massachusetts Spy newspaper of the morning of December 16th. So it's got newspaper accounts up to that morning, because that was the day that the paper came out. It's got handwritten comments that are reprinted from the New York Committee of Correspondence saying, "We heard this story, this is great, keep going, go everybody." And then there's an account that doesn't appear anywhere else that I'm pretty sure is, whether it was Revere or somebody else, whoever showed up in that office said, "Oh my gosh, you guys won't believe what happened. Let me tell you." So they print this on December 24th. On December 25th, in Delaware Bay is sighted the ship Polly, arriving from England with tea bound for Philadelphia. So they get the boat to stop far enough out that it doesn't have to report to customs. They bring the captain, a guy named Captain Ayres, into Philadelphia for a town meeting on the 27th. They show him this broadside that they'd printed with the account of everything that happened in Boston. Essentially, they say, "You really don't want this to happen to your ship, do you?" And he says no. They offer to help supply him for the return voyage. And so he leaves. And it's an example of the ways in which the news networks are shaping events. There's no Philadelphia Tea Party because the ship never gets there because they're of these news networks.
And on the next episode, I promise you, we are going to get into the printing of the Declaration of Independence. Thank you for listening to the Found in Philadelphia podcast. Please check out the podcast website at foundinphiladelphia.com to learn more, see some period images, and find a list of my sources. This episode was researched, written, hosted, and recorded by me, Lori Ament. I want to thank our guests, Jessica Peterson, Joseph Adelman, and Michelle Craig McDonald. Huge thanks to our audio engineer, Carolina Duque, who mixed this episode and provided sound engineering. Music for this episode was produced, composed, and arranged by Steve Secchi for Funk Soul Productions.